There is a code hidden beneath Rwanda's red earth, one that cannot be read in books or myths, but only in the spiraling double helix of its people. That code begins its journey thousands of years ago, far beyond Rwanda's borders. In the dense rainforests of what is now Cameroon and Nigeria, a wave of movement began, not of armies or kings, but of families, farmers, toolmakers, language bearers. This wave didn't stop. It rolled across the continent, like water carving through stone. They were the ancestors of today's Bantu peoples, and their footsteps eventually led them into the lush, fertile highlands of Rwanda. That journey, known as the Bantu Expansion, wasn't a conquest. It was a quiet revolution, and it rewrote the genetic landscape of half the African continent. Today, if you look into the genome of a Rwandan, whether Hutu or Tutsi, you'll find the unmistakable imprint of those travelers. Scientists call it haplogroup E1B1A. It is a marker carried by nearly 80% of Rwandan men. It doesn't divide Rwandans. It binds them together, a silent thread, carried for millennia. This haplogroup is more than a label. It's proof of lineage, of belonging to one of the most influential human migrations in history. Autosomal DNA backs it up too. The majority of Rwandans, whether in rural hills or urban Kigali, carry the same Central and East African genetic signals. Their maternal lines, passed from mother to daughter for centuries, trace back to the same deep African roots. But what makes this story powerful isn't just the science. It's the emotion buried in that discovery. Because while so much of Rwanda's recent history has been told through division, its DNA tells a different story, not of separation, but of shared origin. And yet, here's where the mystery begins. If Hutu and Tutsi both descend from the same ancestral waves, if they carry the same dominant genetic lineage, then how did they come to be seen and treated as if they were biologically different? That answer waits in the next layer. But before we go there, pause for a moment and think. What does it mean when the very cells of a people deny the stories told about them? When the body refuses the borders drawn in blood? The Rwandan genome, ancient and intertwined, doesn't whisper. It declares, we began this story together. There was a time when science was silenced by power, when rulers didn't just conquer land, but rewrote human identity with ink, prejudice, and lies. Rwanda's people, especially the Tutsi and Hutu, became targets of one of history's most destructive narratives, a myth disguised as biology. It began not with research, but with rulers. Under Belgian colonial rule, identity cards were printed not with names alone, but with tribes, fixed like brands. Height, nose shape, cattle ownership, even posture, were measured to divide a population that had lived, married, and farmed together for generations. The myth that Tutsis were Hamitic, outsiders, descended from Caucasian lineages that supposedly swept down from Northeast Africa, that they were superior, that Hutus, in contrast, were native and less evolved. It was a lie so dangerous, it became policy. And it was a lie so deep, it bled into the classrooms, the courts, the churches, and eventually into machete blades. But what happens when DNA speaks louder than history books? Modern genomics shattered the colonial illusion. When researchers sequenced the genomes of Hutu and Tutsi populations, they weren't looking for similarity. They were looking for truth. And what they found silenced a century of propaganda. There is no unique northeastern African lineage in Rwanda's genome. No dominant Ethiopian haplogroup. No Horn of Africa paternal signature. Nothing to support the myth that Tutsis came from elsewhere. Instead, Hutu and Tutsi both carried the same dominant Y-DNA lineage, E1B1A, the signature of Bantu ancestry. Their genetic distance? So small, it falls within the range of cousins. In fact, in multiple SNP studies, Rwandans as a whole were genetically inseparable from neighboring Bantu populations. If DNA is a map, then colonialism redrew it in error, because the real science reveals that these were not two separate peoples, but one intertwined lineage, manipulated into division. The tragedy is not just that this pseudoscience was believed, it's that it was institutionalized. Belgian-issued ID cards listed tribal labels not based on ancestry, but on quotas and stereotypes. A person could be labeled Hutu one day, Tutsi the next, simply by owning more cows. The myth wasn't scientific. It was bureaucratic fiction, rubber-stamped and blood-soaked. Yet the genome has no patience for fiction. Even at the autosomal level, the deeper, recombined layers of DNA that come from both parents, Tutsi and Hutu, show overwhelming overlap. There are no major cluster divergences, no sharp splits. Genetics confirms what oral traditions had long whispered before colonizers arrived, that Rwandans had intermarried for centuries, and the line between tribe was more social than biological. So why did this myth persist? Because it served power. It allowed a small colonial administration to rule more efficiently by creating a visible hierarchy where none existed. But that hierarchy was smoke, and in the modern age, the wind of genomics has blown it away. Today, Rwanda recognizes only one ethnicity, Rwandan, not because science demands it, but because science finally permits it. And so, perhaps, the most extraordinary truth revealed by Rwandan DNA is this, that the body remembers unity, even when history forgets. Not every influence in history arrives with thunder. Some come quietly, like a breeze drifting over the Nile, leaving behind traces too subtle for empire to notice, but not for the genome to forget. Long before modern nations carved borders through Africa, people moved not as tribes, but as bloodlines seeking land, water, survival. From the Nile Valley and East African plains came pastoralists, lean, resilient, and restless. And some of their descendants still echo today in the genes of Rwanda's people. We see it not in headlines or history books, but in the fine print of the Y chromosome. Among Rwandan Tutsis, a small but unmistakable pattern emerges. Nearly 15% carry a paternal lineage known as haplogroup B, a signature shared with Nilotic-speaking peoples like the Dinka and the Maasai. In comparison, only about 4% of Hutus carry this marker. That gap is not random. It whispers of ancient journeys, of men who came from the north with cattle, language, and memory, and stayed. And that's not all. Another genetic trace, less visible, but just as telling, shows up in the form of E1B1B, a haplogroup linked to Cushitic-speaking groups from East Africa and the Horn. Though minor in overall numbers, its presence in 4 to 10% of Rwandan males and a striking 22% among Burundian Tutsis tells of pastoral migrations long before modern settlements took shape. These weren't conquerors. They were part of the human tide that shaped the Great Lakes region, not in war, but in continuity. But here's the twist. These genetic signatures never replaced the existing Bantu foundation. They layered themselves upon it. Like threads of gold in a vast cloth, they added detail, not dominance. The Bantu core remained the canvas. The Nilotic and Cushitic additions simply enriched the tapestry. Some might wonder, if these lineages are real, do they justify old claims of foreign origin for Tutsis? The answer is both scientific and humane. Absolutely not. These lineages are not evidence of invasion. They are the footprints of intermarriage, exchange, and coexistence. No more alien than the wind that carries seeds across borders. Autosomal DNA, which captures the broader picture beyond paternal inheritance, reinforces this truth. The entire Rwandan population, Tutsi included, clusters firmly within East African Bantu genetic groups. There is no sharp divergence, no isolated island of DNA. Even the Nilotic component, though slightly stronger in Tutsi samples, is not unique to them. It's part of a broader regional gradient that extends across Uganda, Kenya, and Sudan. And so the shadow of the Nile is not a boundary, it's a bridge, a soft imprint, not a divide. It reminds us that genetic identity is not static. It is a river, constantly fed by tributaries, altered by landscape, yet always flowing forward. In Rwanda's case, the Nile's quiet contribution became part of that stream. Not loud, not dominant, but permanent. So when we speak of what makes Rwandan DNA unique, we must look beyond borders, beyond myths, and see what the genome reveals, that even the gentlest migrations leave legacies. And sometimes, it's the softest voices that stay the longest. Before the cattle, before the kingdoms, before the roads wound through these hills, Rwanda was forest, wild, dense, and ancient. And within those forests lived a people who carried the oldest stories the continent had to tell. Not in words, but in chromosomes. They are known today as the TWA, Rwanda's smallest ethnic group, often overlooked, but genetically unforgettable. Their ancestry predates the arrival of Bantu speakers, Nilotic migrants, and Cushitic pastoralists. They are not recent. They are residual, the echo of a time before iron, before agriculture, before fixed borders. In most narratives, the TWA appear in a footnote. In the genome, they're a signature. Though their population makes up barely 1% of Rwanda today, their roots go thousands of years deeper than most. Scientists believe their ancestors once roamed across Central and East Africa, surviving on foraging, hunting, and deep ecological knowledge. But it's their genetic legacy that quietly resists the erasure of time. Rwandan DNA contains subtle yet ancient traces, markers like haplogroup L0 on the maternal line, and Y-DNA variants associated with early forager populations. These aren't prominent in national averages, but they exist like archaeological layers in the genome. Hard to see unless you know exactly where to look. L0, one of the oldest mitochondrial haplogroups known to science, tells us a story of survival that goes back over 100,000 years. It's been found in other pygmy populations across the Congo Basin, and its presence in Rwanda, even faint, points to genetic continuity that precedes every other ancestry in the region. The TWA may not have shaped Rwanda's borders, but they shaped its biology. What's more powerful is what this means on an evolutionary scale. While later populations brought language, tools, and livestock, the TWA genome contains adaptations forged in isolation, potentially unique metabolic profiles, forest-specific immune responses, and skeletal traits linked to stature. These aren't just curiosities. They are windows into how human beings adapted long before the age of empires. But here's the tragedy. While their DNA carries deep time memory, the modern TWA are often marginalized, their contributions erased from textbooks and censuses. And yet, even as their voices are hushed, their biology speaks with authority. Genome-wide surveys in Rwanda are still limited, and many TWA genomes remain unsequenced. But based on analogs from Central African forager populations, researchers suspect the TWA carry unbroken threads of genetic memory that have resisted 4,000 years of migration and mixture. They are not isolated because they were forgotten. They are isolated because they were first. In the great mosaic of Rwandan ancestry, the TWA are not a border piece. They are the base layer, the stone upon which every later brick was placed. Their whisper runs beneath every louder voice, and it endures. In a world that often mistakes size for significance, the TWA remind us that genetic power doesn't come from numbers. It comes from depth. There are wounds so deep, they don't leave scars on the skin. They settle into the silence between heartbeats, into the chemistry of breath. But what if history's most brutal moments didn't just haunt memory, but rewrote the very code inside us? In Rwanda, the answer is yes. The 1994 genocide, 100 days of terror, 1 million lives lost, is a chapter of history that still echoes through the soil, the culture, and the families. But now, scientists are discovering that it also echoes in a place no one expected, the genome itself. In a groundbreaking study, researchers examined the DNA of Tutsi women who were pregnant during the genocide and compared it to those who weren't present in Rwanda during that time. What they found wasn't a genetic mutation. It was something more haunting: epigenetic change. Epigenetics is the science of how trauma can leave chemical marks on genes, not changing the letters, but changing how loudly they speak. And in Rwanda, the trauma was so severe, so prolonged, that it altered the gene expression patterns in the women and in the children they carried. The most affected genes? Those tied to stress, emotion, and survival, including regions associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety regulation. These changes don't vanish with time. They replicate. They carry forward. It means the genocide wasn't just a moment in history. It became a biological inheritance. These epigenetic markers don't change a person's identity, but they change how their body responds to the world, how their brain handles threat, how they metabolize stress, how they feel pain, and how deeply they carry it. And here lies a chilling truth. A child born after the genocide, too young to remember a single scream, may still carry biological echoes of what their mother endured. The womb, it turns out, is not a barrier to trauma. It is a bridge. This revelation is more than a scientific curiosity. It forces us to confront how violence, once unleashed, doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It lingers, not only in memory and society, but in biology, in every cell, every generation that follows. And yet, there's resilience in that same code. Because these changes are not destiny. Epigenetic patterns can evolve, can heal, especially when paired with safety, community, and care. Rwanda's story since 1994 has been one of rebuilding, reconciliation, and redefining identity. And now, science suggests that this healing isn't just symbolic. It may also be molecular. In this way, Rwandan DNA tells a story no textbook ever could, of a people who carry not just the history of survival, but its cost and its courage. It's not only a story of what was lost, it's a story of what continues. Africa holds more genetic variation than the rest of the world combined, a living archive of human evolution. And nestled within its Great Lakes region, Rwanda stands not as an exception to this pattern, but as one of its purest reflections. Here, diversity isn't just cultural or linguistic. It's written at the molecular level. Rwandans, despite forming a relatively small nation by land and population, exhibit some of the highest individual-level genetic diversity observed anywhere on the continent. In a single forensic study, 505 Rwandan individuals revealed over 360 distinct autosomal alleles. That's not just data. That's complexity in motion, like thousands of musical notes composed into one identity. The genetic richness here doesn't stop at random variation. It's structured in a very specific way, diverse within, unified across. Rwanda's different ethnic communities, Hutu, Tutsi, and TWA, don't form isolated genetic islands. They form a single, interconnected network, a population whose internal variance surpasses its external boundaries. One might expect, given Rwanda's geography, that rugged mountains and historical conflicts would have caused deep internal splits, that each valley might contain a genetically distinct group. But the opposite is true. Studies show that 93% of genetic variation lies within Rwanda's population, not between ethnic or regional lines. That level of cohesion is rare, not just in Africa, but globally. Compared to neighboring countries like Kenya or Uganda, Rwanda presents a unique paradox. It's small in area, yet massive in genetic depth. Kenya's ethnic map reads like a mosaic of separate tribes. Rwanda's reads like a single canvas, painted with infinite shades of the same story. This cohesion is not accidental. It's the product of centuries of shared settlement, intermarriage, and mobility within borders that, while modern in shape, reflect ancient pathways. Unlike regions shaped by intense tribal isolation, Rwanda has always been a crossroads, not just of peoples, but of genes. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Even though Rwandan DNA shows strong Bantu roots, it carries no single ancestral signature. Instead, it bears the imprint of multiple influences, subtle Nilotic signals, echoes of Cushitic lineages, and faint traces of ancient forest dweller genes. These don't compete. They coexist. In fact, this genetic blend is so well balanced that when scientists analyzed Rwanda's genome-wide data against other African populations, they found Rwandans nearly indistinguishable from their regional neighbors, yet internally more genetically varied than expected. It's as if Rwanda's DNA functions like a mirror, reflecting back the broader human story of the continent, compressed into one nation. And that mirror is not static. It doesn't just show where Rwandans came from. It shows how their story is still unfolding, as the genome continues to respond to migration, environment, and even healing from historical trauma. So when we say Rwandan DNA is unique, it's not because it stands apart from Africa. It's because it embodies so much of Africa at once. Not all legacies are carved in stone. Some live in bloodstreams. Some whisper from chromosomes. And some, like Rwanda's, endure not by resisting change, but by adapting through it. To understand the resilience of Rwandan DNA, you have to see it not as a record, but as a survivor. This is a genome that has withstood more than time. It has withstood upheaval. Wave after wave of migration washed across the Great Lakes, but instead of being erased, Rwanda absorbed them. Not with uniformity, but with balance. Each new ancestry layered onto the last like sediment in ancient rock, forming something stronger, richer, deeper. There's no single origin here, no linear path. Instead, there's a braided ancestry, Bantu lineages anchoring the structure, Nilotic threads giving contrast, Cushitic echoes adding texture, and forest dweller imprints grounding it in the deepest past. A tapestry, not a tree. And yet, the real miracle is not what Rwanda's DNA contains. It's what it has endured. This is a genome that carried its people through forced classification, civil war, cultural rupture, and genocide. It was not reshaped by colonization, but it absorbed the scars. Even in trauma, it never broke, it encoded. And in the wake of tragedy, it began, slowly, to rebuild. The science backs this, from autosomal heterogeneity to Y-chromosomal diversity. Rwanda's gene pool shows neither collapse nor fragmentation. Instead, it reflects what geneticists call a highly retained ancestral core. That means despite centuries of violence and social engineering, the biological foundation remained intact. Resilience, written in nucleotides. But this is more than molecular biology. It's a symbol of rebirth. While ethnic divisions were inflamed from the outside, the genome kept telling a different truth, that the people were never truly separate, that under the artificial categories, there was unity, that what had been torn apart by labels had never actually been broken. And now, in a Rwanda that recognizes only one national identity, Rwandan, the genome finally aligns with the story its people are trying to write. This isn't romanticism. It's data. A genome rich in variation, steady in structure, and uniquely positioned to contribute to global science, medicine, and anthropology. From rare disease markers to forensic databases, Rwanda's genetic knowledge is becoming a gift, not just to itself, but to the world. Because resilience isn't just surviving, it's transforming. And Rwanda's genome has done just that. It's no longer only a record of who its people were. It's a living symbol of who they are becoming. In the end, the uniqueness of Rwandan DNA doesn't come from its differences. It comes from its capacity to hold them all, and still remain whole.